And so I'm going to do the first half, and then Dr. Wong's going to do the second half. So obviously, for those of you who don't know me, I'm at HHS. I'm Russ Brown. I've been on staff now for about 2 years and sort of one of the junior faculty members, but also I've taken on the role last year as the resident wellness director within the department or the residency program. And so sort of I think it's appropriate to kind of ask, well, where should we begin on this journey? Because I kind of walked into this role without really a fully formed set of constraints on the one hand, but also not a fully formed expectation. So it's kind of nice because it's very dynamic. Lots of stuff can be done and I think should be done. And so now we're kind of at the starting point. And so I think should first highlight the ETA code, because I think for those that want to get their credits or whatever, if you want to take that down. Okay. So the objectives of my talk, so I'm going to try to keep it relatively brief just because there's the two of us talking. So basically I want to kind of introduce this role of the resident wellness director, kind of outline what other programs have done at this point, because it is a relatively new sort of thing that people have been identifying and has come up through accreditation and otherwise as something that we should be starting to address and identify. And it's likely going to become a problem not just during residency, but much later on in training. There's lots of literature coming out and lots of editorials talking to this effect that as our roles and our jobs change within the hospital, likely we're going to be dropped into a lot more acute care and stressful situations, and the rate of burnout is likely anticipated to be even higher than what it might already be if we aren't careful and don't start developing proper coping mechanisms. So then the final sort of two things is I'm going to go through some of the results of a resident survey that we did back in the spring, just to kind of get an idea of what the residents were feeling like and get an idea to have a thumbprint of what is the current sort of status in our program, and then start proposing some of the next steps forward of where can we go from here. So I guess the big question I had is, well, why wellness? And so the rates of burnout in the physician population are exceedingly high. It's as high as 50% depending on the specialty. I think OBS-GYN in one of the surveys in the US was as high as 75%. And so, you know, this is definitely a major issue. And this is in relation to about 30% in the general population. So we're almost 2 times as more likely to be burning out. And the reason why this is particularly pertinent is because the big thing is the suboptimal patient care. This is, I think, the part that's gotten a lot of attention from different administrative groups and otherwise, because basically if you have a burnt out physician base looking after your patients, you're going to be doing worse to your patients or worse by them than what you could be. And then there's a greater rate of self-reported errors, but also within your own wellness itself, there's a high risk of depression, suicidal ideation, substance abuse, but also the development of metabolic syndrome, so you're not looking after yourself properly, and so you're sort of sacrificing at those costs. And so it's sort of one of those things that we should really be thinking about it early on, and I think this is where, you know, in the residency level and even earlier is a good time to start developing good habits for later on in life of how to deal with some of this stuff. And I mean, there's so many different sources of stress that have been identified in the literature, and I mean, it's not surprising. Obviously, the long work hours are definitely one of the things. There's this stressful staff-supervisor relationships and dynamics that go on not only at the residency level, but it also happens at the higher levels too sometimes. Lack of timely feedback has been identified as a potential issue and source of stress, because if you don't know how you're doing, it's kind of hard to improve and move forward. And then some of the other stuff that we kind of forget about or have downplayed sometimes is the issue of the high educational debt. So now as residents are coming through their program, we have to appreciate the amount of debt that a lot of us have been carrying until we get to the end is quite a bit higher than what it has in the past, and influencing what people are doing in their choices of careers, as well as the emotional exhaustion and disorganized lifestyle also is contributing. So there's lots of different things that have been identified. And so the other thing, on the other hand, is also who is at risk. And so it's usually those who have the highest workload, are being imposed and have no autonomy within how that workload or how they're imposed with those work. But also, ironically enough, or not ironically, but being female, unfortunately, also seems to increase that risk. Why, I don't know, but those are sort of the 3 big ones that seem to come out when I was looking through some of the different resources that are available. So in terms of what my role is, it's basically was a new role that was created around May of last year. And the idea was They want it to kind of identify and formulate more of a strong, I guess, base of what to do. And so at the moment, we have we have our mentorship program with the residents and staff. But the idea is now we want to build and get a little bit stronger than just that alone. And so it's something that I think we're sort of at the infancy of this whole program, but sort of something we can build and move forward. So because of this sort of relatively new role or concept, it's something where there was some room for structure to be developed and latitude in what we can do, but also at the same time there was certain things that were identified as what they wanted us to kind of include within it. Now, one of the big things is how does this role fit within the current program? And I think one of the big things to make sure that the residents and otherwise know everyone is that we're going to try to keep this independent from the RTC slightly, so that basically anything that comes forward through the the wellness side of things is somewhat confidential unless there's obviously blaring red flags that needs to be identified or brought to the RTC. But also then at the same time is realizing that there will be some interaction with the RTC as issues and things do get identified, so that it does feedback both ways, but that it is sort of a separate entity. So it's not as though I'm going to be part of the RTC directly and reporting on what's come through or anything that I might see. Now, in terms of what others are doing, so the University of Saskatchewan probably has the most formalized curriculum that I could find in terms of the anesthesiology resident wellness program. And so this was part of a huge set of publications that came out with physician wellness back in 2017. The CJA had a whole issue on it. And so for the residents, there was 2 big papers in this. And so they talked about their formalized curriculum with this modular set of curriculum that were 8 different elements that were divided throughout the residency program. Then they had the peer support curriculum, so that sort of they had the residency wellness committee and sort of different things that they did. Then they also had self-directed learning activities. And I mean, this is quite impressive that they did quite a bit, but at the same time, it's a lot of work. I don't know what the exact value might be because it's a little bit structured or rigid and not as dynamic as what we might otherwise want. And the other thing is we don't know exactly what worked then, and as the programs evolve, we also, I think, need to be somewhat flexible, and also resources. This takes a huge amount of resources that might not necessarily have available. And so I think it's important to sort of take a step back and be like, okay, well, let's see what we can do ourselves with a limited resource base and also pick and choose sort of the most top elements. So instead of kind of going through this huge broad program, how about we kind of start slowly and sort of identify and hit the hot ticket areas first. And so to compare to what we are doing now, so we do have the formalized mentorship program. So every resident as they come in is identified and put with a faculty member. And so obviously those relationships, some are a little bit stronger than others. And it's like anything that, you know, being assigned a mentor is somewhat, depends on that relationship and how you bond and interact with them. But indirectly, probably most of us will eventually identify people informally that we relate with as well. And so then we just recently created, as I mentioned, the resident wellness director role. And so sort of my thoughts at this point, instead of trying to prescribe a program onto the residents, I think it's probably a little bit better to kind of take that step back and have a look and see, well, what can we do that would be of greatest value for that limited time and resources that we have? The other part that I think we should highlight is that you can see it ourselves that every single resident group is different. So if you were to compare the PGY1s to the 2s to the 3s to the 4s and the 5s, it's not only their level of training, but within that group and that dynamic, they're also different. And so it's sort of important to appreciate that there is quite a bit of flexibility and dynamicism between that. And so that's something that I think we should try to play into and take advantage of in terms of what we're doing too. So I think one of the things that came out when I was reading through the literature is, and realizing that there was all these different elements, is that, well, let's kind of figure out what it is that might be the problem or what might be some of the sources of stress and figure out where things are at. So I had a survey that I put together, and it was a voluntary 10-question survey that was emailed through 3 different processes, trying to catch residents to make sure that no one was ignoring the emails that came through. So I had the program admin send it out. I had the chief resident send it out, and I had it put into the newsletter. So between those three sources, I was very happy to see that within that 3-week time frame, 26 of the residents had responded, which is 70%, which is pretty reasonable. So I kind of trust the results of the survey itself because I think it will give some value to what to do next. So some of the things that we did learn, so what we're looking at, I know this slide's a bit busy, but basically you have the residents broken out into their PGY years, so 1 through 5, and their overall. And they were asked to rate their level of stress. So you have those who rate it as low versus moderate versus high. And what you can see is that as 1s and 2s kind of progress through, their stress levels kind of change from being kind of in that low to moderate range to when they kind of get into the 3, 4, 5, you see this very structured or rapid increase. And the 5s, obviously, understandably that they are a little bit more stressed than not, but you do see that clear shift as we go through the program. So definitely the upper years, residents are much more stressed out. The other way of looking at it is as well, does this correlate with the burnout rate? And so burnout itself is characterized in 3 realms. It's emotional exhaustion, reduced sense of self or accomplishment, and depersonalization. So I kind of put together a question, and I borrowed it from somewhere else, was more often than not, do you feel emotionally exhausted, reduced sense of personal accomplishment, or depersonalized, and particularly, irritable or angry? And sort of the idea is are we seeing burnout within our resident groups? And so again, we have the 5 different years down at the bottom here. And we start off with very little to somewhat to a great extent. And what you can kind of see, unfortunately, is in the great extent is you kind of do see that increase as we go through the 5 years. And so it's definitely something that you can see that hopefully we can work with the 1s and the 2s early on to potentially develop things to help reduce this later on potentially. But at the same time, we can start thinking, or we should start thinking, what can we do in the 4s and 5s to hopefully minimize this effect. But definitely what we're seeing is that there is a fairly great risk of burnout, and although we're less than 50% if we were to take this in the overall group, but you can see in the upper years definitely we're getting there. So I guess the next step would be, well, what are the stressors? What is it that's causing the issues itself? And so residents were given about 15 different categories of things that were identified in the literature as potential stressors, and I asked them to rank them and work their way through. So what you're seeing here is on the bottom, I picked 5 that did come out. So lack of time, inadequate downtime, issues with feedbacks, evaluations, future work situations and employment, and professional interactions with staff. And again, on the bottom, you can see that you have the different PGY levels. So as it gets darker green, they get more senior, and then the overalls in the orange. So not surprising, time pressure is going to exist. And so it's sort of one of those things that time management skills and structure will definitely be quite important. But some of the other things that did come out of it is sort of the inadequate downtime or vacation time. You can see that sort of as they move through the program. I'm not sure what happened to the 4s. You guys, I guess, are a little bit more relaxed, but more or less you do see this general trend going up. Interestingly, one of the things that came out that I was sort of fits with this whole timely feedback is the issues of resident feedback and evaluations. And you can see the PGY2s for the current new group moving through with the CBD program. This was identified by every single one of them. So this is something that we need to start thinking about as faculty, that when we do these evaluations and when we're asked to do these evaluations, we need to start thinking of how important this is for them. But the other thing is something that maybe we need to be assessing and discussing on the other side of how we're doing these evaluations. So it's something that we're going to have to look at, because that's definitely caused quite a bit of problems in the early years. What'll be interesting is to see is the CBD program moves along, is how that progresses as well. Do we see an increase and see this consistently go up, or are we able to identify and try to improve that? The other thing that's sort of interesting is the work situation, future employment. And that kind of fits with the economics that I was talking about earlier, that people do feel the financial stress. And then finally, the professional interactions, including intimidation from, and this is specifically the anesthesia staff that were identified. I had broken it out into 5 different categories. And so definitely one of those things that we definitely need to also be aware of is that there might be perceived or perceptions that even though we don't realize it in our day-to-day interactions, that we're sort of doing things. And so it's like anything that we just sort of to be aware that there is this issue that has been identified. And so it's something that think about it yourself. So how you manage and interact with learners that you're with in the OR might be something that we can kind of look at and think about and reassess ourselves, because sometimes we say things and we do things and we don't even realize that we're doing it or behaving in a certain way, but it's being perceived on the other end as well. Now, not only do we have the stressors, but one of the big things was how are the residents actually coping? And so I'm very happy to see that most of them do have healthy coping mechanisms that were identified. And so again, you're looking at the different PGY years, and the three things that came out as being their top things is, fortunately, they are talking with their residents and peers, which is exactly what you should be doing and sort of what has been identified from my understanding of the literature. Unfortunately, though, in terms of some of the other things that they do outside of their normal training abilities, so relaxing, doing something enjoyable, or exercise, you can see that the 1s and 2s who had the lowest level of stress were doing the most of this, whereas those who are the most stressed are not. And so this is one of those things that you can see that there's this very clear trend in the later years. As they get more stressed, they're doing less of these extra things. So it's something that sort of I'll have to talk with them and sort of figure out, and there's no perfect way to manage it, but there's definitely this clear correlation that as you get more senior and as the time constraints and otherwise go up, you're sacrificing yourself and trying to figure out a way to overcome that. Now, the other sort of final big gambit is what would the residents like to see us doing, and what can we put our resources at? And so again, they were given about 10 different items that they could identify, and the 4 top ones that came out, ironically enough, I was not expecting the financial and career planning to be such a high percentage of residents identifying this as an issue, but this might be something that we'll have to start thinking about. And it's been identified, and I think it's one of those sort of white elephants that we kind of all know about the monies and the economics of it, but we don't really talk about it. And so it's something that might be one of those indirect sort of hidden curriculum type things that you might talk about with the residents in the OR when you're looking for topics, is talk about some of the financial aspects of our work and what we're doing and sort of how things have progressed or our own experiences with our financial or career planning. But at the same time, it might be worth it. We'll have to start looking at finding ways of getting them exposed in a healthy way to different financial planning groups or accounting strategies to identify and figure out, because now that residents are coming out with these huge amounts of debt, which is upwards, I think, of 290,000, I think was the last number I read, it's of course it's stressful. The other thing that I'd like to point out, so team building and mentorship is definitely something that they are interested in. So I think this kind of speaks to the fact that we do have our formalized program in place, but we need to build upon that and sort of try to, I think, improve that to the next level. Now, interestingly, I put in the other 2 categories that weren't necessarily the highest in terms of the overall, but what you can see is the more senior years identified the interest in sort of getting some emotional wellness training or exposure, and potentially coming up with a workshop exploring some resiliency training, developing coping mechanisms, because this kind of fits with exactly what we saw. Those who are the most stressed are the ones that kind of we might want to put some strategies and tools in their hands so that they have a way of managing or developing or sort of finding a way to cope and get through and survive, obviously, their big Royal College exam that the 5s are currently writing, but also be able to sort of get through that in a healthy way. And so definitely these are sort of the 4 big areas I think that we'll be looking at in particular. So I think all years would be interested in this, as well as the team building, but I think in the later years we might need to be starting to consider sort of what other things that we can be putting into place and working with. And I mean, it's interesting because how does this fit with the previous findings from the University of Saskatchewan? And so, I mean, they did rank time management and life skills quite highly, but the mindfulness and stress management, it depends on the year that you're in, because the more senior years, yes, definitely. But then sort of the things that they had lower down, I think, were some of the financial and career planning and otherwise. So you can see that this list itself doesn't totally apply to our group, and so it just goes to show the importance of understanding and appreciating that we're unique from what this was and that we need to be doing our own thing that's different than that. And again, the same thing is we go through and we redo the survey, we might find very different results that at the current time frame this is the problem, and in 2-3 years from now there'll be other things that come up. And so it's sort of important to appreciate that this isn't a fixed list, and so we're kind of seeing a little bit of a deviation from this already. The other thing that I did ask was to find out what should be the real role for the resident wellness director, and kind of gave a few different options of what the residents thought. And so did they want me to kind of act as a coordinator for wellness activities and sort of plan everything for them? Did they want me to be a liaison between services? So for example, if I have a resident come to me, identify an issue, do they want me to refer them on and tell them where they can get these different sources of help? But I think the most important and overwhelming answer was they want me to kind of act on their behalf, to be the resident champion, so to be the one that's kind of speaking up and advocating on their behalf. And so I want them to know that that's sort of where I think we're going to move, and that's where I'm going to try to focus my attention on, because very clearly this has been identified as what they would kind of like done. Obviously the other two will be there, but I think it was overwhelmingly clear exactly what they would like me to be helping or functioning in what capacity. So I guess to sort of put it all together, so what are the things that we can do to improve things? So I think one is definitely that continued support and continue to develop the resident faculty mentorship program and relationships, both through the informal and formal routes. I think the increased awareness between staff and residents for some of the issues as they arise. So for example, again, I can't reiterate enough the resident evaluations in the CBD program. It's quite heavy for everybody, and it's a learning curve. We're still in that early phase across the board, and I think it's one of those things that we definitely will need to kind of be flexible with and understand and appreciate. And so it's one of those things that as we go through, it's again, like anything is that nothing's ever fixed 100% in stone, and so to find ways to minimize and to improve this for everyone is something that I think will be an important next step. The other thing is that when do we do any of these sort of activities? So if we were to do kind of wellness training, or if we were to kind of do any team building activities, I think it was also clear I asked for time frames of when. And I think probably the best would be to do it informally. So during a time that's kind of almost like a downtime now. So for example, in between the PGY sessions from the morning to the afternoon, kind of catch that lunchtime. Everyone's around anyway. And that way it's not adding on extra time. It's not adding on extra sort of commitments. It's not in evenings or weekends, which are already pretty highly valued. And then that way it could be a time that we could potentially develop sort of a small set of talks or things to kind of go through, but also informal meetings, just kind of find out what's going on, any other issues, because again, it's very dynamic. I'm sure if I were to send this survey out now or see what the results are, they would be different than they were even 3 months ago, and sort of to appreciate that in itself. And then the other thing is this, I think we're going to have to start considering addressing some of the other stressors that did come up. So I think, for example, the financial and career planning is something that I was very surprised to see so heavily across all years. And so it's something that I'll have to be looking into and trying to figure out what would be appropriate for the PGY level, but also we'll have to be discussing with some of the other people within our department and figuring out how we can try to get this to the residents and vice versa, but also open up those discussions again in the hidden curriculum. So being comfortable to talk with your staff and faculty when you're kind of in that awkward, quiet moment of what do we talk about next in the OR, to talk about some of these things, just to kind of find out people's experiences, know what's going on. And so it might be just one more topic and sort of opening up to sort of that idea of talking about some of the numbers and things. Okay. So I guess just to kind of close out, just to show this is our new baby, it's Ayla. And this is our big brother, Aiden, who's very excited about this and made me late this morning too because he didn't want me to leave. Okay, so any questions, comments?
So
yep.
First of all, this is amazing, the work that you've done collecting data, and all that. I took pictures of everything you've done there. It's an amazing job. I think one thing that we have to acknowledge, first of all, to the residents. A lot of us, we don't know what the hell to do. even after so many years.
And my life. And my life. Do you think most of us are absolutely good? Like we're still thinking about money despite many years of practice. Not most of us.
Well,
Probably not.
Uncle Chris up here, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
I have to say something. I give these guys the financial planning lessons from the beginning. I think it's really important. No, I'm being really serious now. 50% of marriages break up because of financial stress. And you look at all the stresses in someone's life, and then you think life is just going to happen. Well, the number one role is the secret to happiness is lowering your expectations. And your financial expectations are unrealistic. So I think you should be bringing in financial planning on day one of their residency. I think they should understand what future value calculators are, and I think they should understand how buying coffee is destroying their lives. And I just use that as a metaphor because it's that spending that causes all those other stresses that affect the residency. And Bruno's right. Everyone waits till this magical period where they're going to learn something, and they didn't have the benefit of my father had a German immigrant best friend who felt that he was my dad's accountant, and from the time I was 6 years old, he felt he could yell at me. So you guys never had that benefit. So I grew up with that benefit. They petrified to see your accountant because he was going to yell at you again and again and again, and it stuck with me forever. So I think you guys, it should be part of our program, and most of the financial stresses are unintentionally self-induced. And I think when you look at your residency in 4 and 5 years and financial things start to bother you, that's not something you could have fixed in a week. It should have happened 4 or 5 years before. So I think you should make it part of it. I've got an accountant that would volunteer to come in. But I think you need that experts talk to them, not just me. So.
I think bringing, I never finished my thing. I think bringing somebody from outside, as physicians are not experts in money.
Yeah.
And somebody who dedicates most of their life to medicine will never really be. But there are some really basic things that I think can be taught throughout maybe the 5 years, not necessarily one session the first year.
Yeah.
Maybe you can ask them in the first year, what is it that you like? Second year, and have a continuous financial education throughout the whole thing.
Yeah.
Different people, different experts, and people who have not interest in having your money to them, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes we have classes on financial advising companies and all that stuff, and the truth is they're taking at least 3-4% per year, regardless if you make a profit or not, they do make money. So I think it's not hard to learn how to invest. It's not hard to learn our speech, FSAs, and all that stuff. It's pretty easy. But I think bringing somebody from outside, I think would be really nice. Maybe a brother, somebody, or uncle, or somebody, or somebody who just cares about our health and well-being.
Definitely. I think Anne had a question first.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Okay.
I was just going to say
Yeah.
that, MD Management does give seminars for residents. But I just wanted to touch on the point that you made about the evaluations being very high. So for the CBD residents, that's been identified as a real problem. That they end up chasing after these, EPA evaluations at
Definitely.
at the risk of actually learning. But I think it's worthwhile to look across disciplines as well, not just us.
No.
This
And
is a bigger problem. So to
I
really
definitely-
work together
Exactly.
to tackle this.
And that's just it, because I think we happen to be the early sort of guinea pigs going in. And so we happen to be the ones that this has been identified first, but I have a feeling that it's going to happen every single year. And like I was saying is that if we kind of move along, I have this feeling, unfortunately, this is going to track upwards and going to be consistently a program-wide problem if we don't start identifying and figuring out solutions now. And so I think that'll be something that we'll have to be thinking about, because again, it's a learning curve. This whole CBD program has been a giant session of learning of resources and resource management as well. And so I think it's like anything is that we have a starting point, and as we assess and we look at it, figuring out ways to improve and tighten things so that we can sort of try to make it better for everybody, because it's on both sides.
Good morning, first of all, thank you very much, Ross. It's a great talk. Is there a formal process for our residents if they feel that they are in a situation of being harassed, particularly by anesthesia staff? Will they directly come to you? Like, do they, rather than having to find their way in an already uncomfortable situation?
Unfortunately, I don't think that's happened yet, but I think that's a very important set of steps to happen now. Obviously, these situations have arisen before and have been dealt with in various ways before, but I think part of this is figuring out that I am here and that I am in this role is the first big step to realize is that, yes, I'm another person to come to, that I'm independent of the RTC, so we can kind of go through the various sort of aspects of what to do and how to kind of start managing, but then also then I can independently go and use the confidentiality of it to talk to the other people so that things can be identified starting in a confidential manner and then escalate as appropriate. There unfortunately have been very specific scenarios and situations that have arisen that I am aware of, but definitely I think there's not a formalized process that I know of as of yet with myself included in that sequence.
Yeah, I think it's great that you'll be included in that because if there is that sense, there's a tremendous power differential. And then there's also the concern about surviving the rest of your residency. And 5 years is a long time.
It sure is. And that's, I think the important thing is to identify an issue early as it's sort of in its seedling size before it becomes this massive mega issue. And so I think the earlier that things, and by trying to keep things kind of confidential and identifying them at that root of the cause and then sort of maybe avoiding it altogether blowing up.
Dealing with things early. So right now then the plan moving forward is for them to know that they can come to you.
Yeah, that this role even exists.
And that would be where we would direct people as well.
Exactly, and so then the same thing for the faculty to realize is that this role exists and that if they have issues or they can direct residents this way as well as, so it's one extra resource that's available to them. Yeah. Hey, Desi.
So, I mean, the first head office, just dealing with the intimidation issue, has come up with a formalized process of addressing any complaints. It's still in the draft stage, unfortunately, so it's a faculty-wide issue. But it should be rolled out pretty soon. I mean, our department, particularly with James, have taken a zero tolerance approach to it, and any issue has they've gone through the rounds of That's just to add to this, I think for this to work and to really take off, it has to be completely independent of the RTC, which you sort of mentioned a few times. Just any information that comes to the RTC has to be done with the consent and permission of the residents.
Exactly.
At arm's length for this to really work.
And that's will be sort of the important thing. It's kind of being that neutral territory, and that's kind of where I kind of see myself as being like the Switzerland of it all, of understanding that there's obviously two sides to any story, but to also appreciate and make sure that the residents know they have a way of coming forward and can start the process at least. Yeah.
Actually, this is, I think, an important topic, so I'm happy to do my talk on that at another time and finish. I think this is a very important topic. Is that
So
okay?
I think Ellie.
I'm just trying to rush through mine. I should try to-
Sure. Good idea.
Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation, eye-opener, and thank you for the residents who really participated in the survey. So one of the stressors for them was EPA and evaluation, which is quite understandable. And most of them, early in the morning, they will share with us what kind of EPA they want, what kind of evaluation, if they want both, if they want three. So there is good communication there. Do you think, and sometimes OR gets busy and sometimes staff may forget or may increase the stress. Do you think what kind of ways are there, just because it's not their job to ask again and again and again? So once in the morning, once maybe in the afternoon,
And that,
maybe just a reminder?
and that might be where we're going to have to look at the process itself, because it's hard to chase down faculty and it's not fair to them.
No.
And so it should be something that we'll have to look at because they are also required to get a certain number of evaluations done. But we might have to consider looking at a model where we see how many were requested and how many were completed. And then it'll become sort of another side of the story of making sure, because it's like anything, I think, if you are someone who does do evaluations, you'll see that, you know, you agree to one and then they'll ask for a few, which is fair and happy to do it. But I think it's because the receptiveness has not been faculty-wide of doing them to the complete degree, unfortunately.
So I guess my question is how we can.
So how can we identify, and I mean, it's sort of difficult because, for example, say we had them email the evaluations to us to do them, so it's been identified that it was sent to the faculty, it'll become like the good old days where everyone used to be like, put it in my box, and everyone would ignore it. But at the same time, it would be a way to track that they have requested it. So we'll have to think about that process. Sorry, Chris?
Just the evaluation part, the staff have to realize that's part of their day, just like handing your drug sheet in is part of your day. And the residents should, in my opinion, should realize that they're there to make the staff man's life easier and open up the computer, have it ready to go, so bang, it's done in a few seconds. So if you facilitate it, it works a lot faster. And most of us should be reminded that it's part of our day's work, and when the paperwork's done, you go home. The comment I wanted to make was just the issue on wellness. There's a difference between, I'm not being misogynist here.
Yeah.
Guys are a lot less willing to talk, and I think you can put out all the forms you want in the world. Most men aren't going to talk until they have to, or until the wheels are falling. So I think that, wow, you're an exception. I hate to put it out of your hands, program director's hands, but I think part of your annual evaluation should be that how's it going question, and just leave it wide open. And it should be part of the annual assessment and dive in a little bit, because a lot of guys aren't going to say anything until it goes after year after year after year. So, and it sometimes just takes a quiet moment that comes what's bothering.
Definitely, and I mean, sometimes some of the good times to be doing that, like in my experience, is like, you know, after hours you're about to run away from your call, and to just find out, and sometimes you find out someone will unload a whole lot in a very short time frame of when you do ask that exact question, and I think it's important that we're all aware that's an important question and a valid question to ask, because, you know, it's one thing to mechanically go through your day and do everything pristine, but then again, it is just one of those things to find out how people are doing or how they're coping or how they're managing. And you know, there's a big life outside of the OR and the operating room or the learning environment that they're exposed to. And so it's very important, I think, to appreciate that and to, I think, open up and sort of find out how they're doing and make them aware that, you know, we all have these different things. We all deal with them in different ways, but also that people do want to talk. And I think it's very important that as the staff people that we do ask these questions sometimes, just to kind of see and get a thumbprint on how things are happening. Because unfortunately, no one's life is ever perfect. But at the same time, some things that might be going on that aren't identified, or like you said, people are very quiet about it or sort of reserved and until things are a big problem. And so I think it's something that we should be doing. I'm sorry, Dr. Dauphin.
Thanks again, that's very good. There was an office ombudsman for the resident. Is that what you are?
This is separate again from the ombudsperson. And so...
Because it seems to be, I'm not completely sure as to whether it should come together. And I would add the other thing as well is that we found that it's good to look after the resident wellness. Appreciate that very much. Thank you for this. What about the staff wellness?
So that's where Dr. Wong was coming in. Yeah.
Okay, so looking for the time, yeah, I would like to hear about this one. But by the same token as well, one of the issues is that you have to be mindful of one thing. A lot of people hate the college because the college seems to be defending mainly the patient, not the physician. And somehow there must be a venue whereby there will be an objective approach. There must be a mechanism also that if your resident is not behaving accordingly, whether there will be a process, not evaluation, someone can be contacted to talk about it.
And definitely, and I think the big thing is to make sure that they're aware that there's avenues that they can come forward, and as staff that we're asking and helping direct them to these different sources and to kind of move through and help them develop and devise healthy coping mechanisms. And like Chris was saying is that, you know, sometimes we leave things until really late in the sequence until everything falls apart, but instead to kind of, let's try to identify things early, because the earlier you deal with anything, usually the easier it is, because you can at least come up with a plan no matter how bad it is to try to mitigate or avoid. And so that's, I think the big thing is that kind of helping them develop and devise mechanisms that they are going to be able to cope. But the big thing is to start this in residency, so it's part of an automatic process by the time they get to faculty level and working on their own independently. The idea isn't to kind of do everything for them, but instead to teach them how to manage things healthy or in a healthy way, so that when they do go out into the world and practice on their own, and they are dealing with these even sort of sometimes more terrible situations, that they have a healthy way of managing and coping with it. Because unfortunately in the past there have been quite a number of different issues that have gone quite far, and then very terrible outcomes have come from it on the faculty end because they just weren't able to cope or didn't know what to do, and then sort of unfortunately whether they have sort of had full breakdowns or otherwise. And so I think the big thing is let's start looking at this early, and sort of like any teaching process, let's teach a healthy way to deal with it, and then sort of that's sort of my thought process of what I would like to see done. Yeah, Dr. Farrell?
Yeah, I'm actually stunned by the statistic of what percentage of residents feel they're being harassed by anesthesia staff. That is, to me, very sad, and I hope I'm not one of those people. But what I'm wondering is, if you're giving, none of us likes criticism,
Yeah.
if you're giving what you see as constructive criticism in a direct and open manner, is that considered harassment? Like, what does that harassment mean?
And so I didn't formally branch out further into those. And so I think that's sort of, again, figuring out, because I was, to be honest, I was surprised by that as well. And so I think that's the big thing, is to find out. And so whether it be that we sort of, technically they're supposed to be doing faculty evaluations so they can feed back things. And so I think maybe it could be that the pointed feedback or criticism might be taken in a way. And sometimes it's also just for ourselves to take the step back and think, am I saying this in the most polite or direct way, getting the point across, but not being to the point of being sort of intimidating about it. And I mean, it's like anything, we all kind of will do things, and I've done it myself where I've said something and then kind of 2 seconds later I've been like, that's not quite what I mean when I think about it further. And so I think it's important that we just recognize that we work in very stressful situations. In the heat of the moment, sometimes we'll say things, but to kind of self-reflect a little bit and make sure that we're really happy with what we said, or take a moment before we say it, and then sort of be aware.
I mean, if that, I think it's really important to dive down into what that harassment means to different people, because harassment to one person may not be harassment. For me, the easiest thing is to check off excellent down the list, and then the resident's happy and I'm happy, and it's very actually hard for me personally to actually give negative comments.
Yeah.
It's much easier not to. So I would be very interested if those comments are considered harassment.
Definitely.
I think we need to kind of dive into.
Yeah, I think you're correct, because again, it's, and so that's just it, is, you know, because there was 15 elements in there. And so now that we've identified some of the hot points, let's dissect that further. And I think you're correct. We should find out exactly what it is. And sorry, Mark?
So I think for that harassment thing, anesthesia staff, when I fill out the survey, it's like anesthesia staff and then other healthcare providers as well. So I think they're really mixed in there. So the nurses up on all
Yeah.
right? So it's not like if you get ranking between anesthesia staff and other health providers.
So the way it was set up is you could pick through the different, so I had like administrative staff, I had sort of other allied health support staff and otherwise, because I was very concerned that there would be that exact scenario, is that there would be specific subgroups potentially. Yeah, and that's just, but yeah, and even once is, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think if that statement is correct, then residents
Yeah.
But just to add to it too, although it's up to 50%, it's not pervasive in the faculty.
No.
There's a few bad apples, essentially, creating the problem. So.
Yeah, it's very skewed. It's like anything. You can have 100 days, 99 of which are perfect and one is bad, and you will remember the one bad one, but not the 99 good ones. I'm sorry, Catherine?
Yeah, I think what Dr. Farrell said is important. Like, it's important to discern what exactly constitutes harassment. But and obviously I can't speak for everybody, but I don't think that we're collectively like such a sensitive group that, we don't appreciate direct feedback, or, I think we all want to improve, we all appreciate critical appraisal. So I would be really surprised if that was part of it. I think we all appreciate getting honest feedback. I think it's the other interactions that people have to understand.
So basically this is, I think, an important starting point, and clearly lots of topics have been identified now. So now I kind of have a bit of a sort of platform of where to go next, and so we can kind of see these different elements, and so I think definitely have sort of areas to work towards as my next steps. Yep.
I think this topic that Dr. Farrell has touched on and been addressed by the residents is really important. I think we need to create a safe space that we really dissect and find out what exactly is happening on both sides and the interpretations to really get that safe dialogue so that we can actually work towards, sort of a proper approach to addressing whatever might be at issue.
Definitely.
In
And
a way that's informed by both perspectives very clearly, and having both in the same room.
exactly, in a safe environment.
In a very safe
Yeah.
environment, and very much dialogic
Because
interaction.
I think I'm sure I'm not the only one that feels that way, but as a faculty member, I would never want to feel like I'm someone who's harassed a resident. I don't think any of us would want to feel like that. But at the same time, so I think it's one of those things, and vice versa. We don't want to be bullied by anyone else either. And so it's just kind of figure out, and I think that will be sensitive, but something to be, at least being aware is a big step.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think we have to also be aware that there's a very robust informal wellness support system going on amongst the residents. They've been amazing in supporting.
Definitely.
Shannon at the pub scene.
Yeah.
There's a lot of informal support going on.
Definitely, and like I said, what I was really happy to see was that, like, looking at the sort of coping strategies and mechanisms, they have a very healthy approach to how they're dealing with it. There's a few other questions that I avoided, but one of which was sort of finding out they had a sort of negative interaction in the trauma bay. What did they do? And sort of what I was worried is that I get this overwhelming response that they just ignore it. But fortunately, most of them do not. They go and will go and seek discussions with other colleagues, staff, or otherwise. And so they don't just sit there and fester on it. They are very much already do have a very healthy approach. And so I think to keep building and supporting those interactions will also be very, very important.
I think, first of all, one idea that I had for the better evaluations, attached evaluations to money. Like we already receive, right, whatever for our teaching, there's a stipend that we receive every year. Yeah. If we attach the number of evaluations that we do into the money, that may be an extra incentive. And maybe more work, but that's an idea.
Good idea, Bruno, but I honestly can say we don't have the budget for that.
Yeah.
It would have to, if we did, we'd have to pay it from something else, so.
It's,
We'd have to make it per capita based on.
No, it's money that we already receive every year.
Yeah, so you're saying we allocate it based on value.
Yeah, that's my idea. Then the other thing too is, like, we're attached to, like, the reason why the harasser exists is because once he was a resident and became stressed out throughout the year, and this suddenly became dispersonalized, and this person thought that that's what they were, a depersonalized person with debts to pay. And then they start harassing other people unawareingly that they're doing it. Okay? So why are we attached to this thing that, residents already said in their survey that sometimes they have no time to do something else. In the department right now, the grown-ups are going through a huge problem because we are overworked, stressed out, and like really not happy about life, grumpy. And why do we start this in residency? Like, why do we start working like crazy. Like the amount of like resting and self-reflection and spirituality that we should have in order to be healthy in relationship to how much we work is so far off towards being unhealthy and stressed out and sick. We're supposed to be the healthy ones. We're supposed to be the healthcare professional. So people look to us and say, I want to be like that guy. Do you think patients look at us and I want to be like that guy? I don't think they do that right now. And why don't we start doing that? Like and I know it's like so far out in the future maybe. I know it's going to take forever. But we can't be we can't be attached to our crappy past and how we were taught medicine and how we're like, no, we're supposed to push through. But this is not healthy.
No, and I think that's where I think sort of what I'm kind of digging at is starting at the grassroots and trying to develop healthy strategies so that, we talk 5-10 years from now and when the residents are now faculty, is that they're that much more forgiving and understanding and appreciating and start teaching healthy habits further down. And so then the idea being is that we'll eventually get to a self sort of, I guess, promoting cycle of sort of a healthy way of managing and coping and dealing with things instead of just sweeping everything under the rug and ignoring it, but instead sort of developing. And so that's sort of the idea is let's start early and kind of work our way through.
My point was going to be that hours need to decrease at some point.
Yeah.
Hours need to decrease. Like the way these guys work is insane. All the residents in university insane. I don't know how it can be. I don't know how, but we can't be victims of the how. We have to have the intention to change it, and then the how is going to show up.
Yeah.
I was going to say a small thing I'm finding just in terms of getting those emails, because I still find quite a few staff will be surprised, the CBD residents, that really we're expected to get 2 a day.
Yeah, I think the education aspect of what's required and requested, because I think that's just it. And so it probably, if I had to guess, would probably be more senior or disengaged from the teaching side of things, faculty, but definitely it's a learning curve, like I said, and so it's to reinforce and keep reiterating. It's like anything, you have to say it a bunch of times before, and we can send them however many emails, but most of them are ignoring them anyway, so they'll read the first one line and then that's usually about it, unfortunately. Okay.
With the medical students, they do it on their cell phone, and I feel like that's a lot easier than trying to find logging into computer. Is there any way to put the resident ones on the phone so we're using our devices rather than possible computers?
That's a great question.
Yes.
It doesn't really scale out to a phone. You have to scroll around in a very descriptive manner.
Like that adds.
Yeah.
But
It's a stopgap measure of the evaluation system. Med system working, so it wouldn't be worth the time, energy, money to do that. But you can design evaluation system that works on phone tablets and computers, but that's not what we have. I even find the medical school hard because you can't even see what you're evaluating. You have to go over here and back over here. And
yeah, usually I break their phone.
I just can't see it. It's side step.
You can have it under, I have like a folder where I have like a link to all the EPAs, and I just click it and then stuff.
So again, that's but that's exactly, and that's just it, and that's part of the whole process and evaluation and looking at how we're doing it and ways to improve it, and that's one key example right there. If we could fix it or tailor it so it's even easier, that might facilitate getting more done. And so.
So thanks for the excellent talk. Thanks for keeping on this goal.
No problem.
We will address faculty wellness as well, but